Was Ramses II white? Ramses II is undoubtedly the most famous pharaoh today. European Egyptologists eventually called him the Great, most likely due to the length of his rule, which contributed to the weakening and eventual demise of the 19th dynasty. Indeed, Ramses' reign spanned half of the 19th dynasty's duration. As a result of this new fame, modern researchers and the mainstream media made him the face of ancient Egypt. We've all already seen at least one of his depictions. And today, the image of the concept of Pharaoh is formed based on Europeans' perception of what Ramses looked like, despite the fact that there are various aspects hinting that he may not be the best fit to symbolize the typical Egyptian pharaoh. The Ramesside dynasty, the 19th, was a little bit distinct from 99% of the other ones. And there are several pharaohs who, in my opinion, are more important in Kemet's history than Ramses. However, for reasons that we will discuss in this video, Egyptologists barely mention them. So, why is Ramses II the favorite pharaoh of the mainstream media? Ramses' mummy was discovered in 1881, together with the mummies of more than 50 other monarchs and nobles, in a hidden royal cache at Deir el-Bahri. The pharaoh's mummy stands around 1.7 meters or 5 feet 7 inches tall and has an aquiline nose and strong jaw. The mummy was examined forensically by Pierre-Fernand Sicaldi, head forensic scientist at Paris Criminal Identification Laboratory. He noticed that the mummy had somewhat wavy, red hair. Based on this attribute and cranial traits, he inferred that Ramses II was of Berber type and hence fair-skinned, according to his race-based research. This is where the belief that Pharaoh Ramses II was white or fair-skinned originated. And, as a result, all portrayals, reenactment, and depictions of that pharaoh in all forms of media depict him as a pale-skinned and sometimes blue-eyed man. These factors are probably why Ramses II is mainstream media's favorite pharaoh. And since he is now used as the face of ancient Egypt, it completely changes the way people perceive that civilization. He became the archetype of what an Egyptian pharaoh looked like. That is problematic, and you will understand why in the following video. A few months ago, a team of specialists recreated his face according to his mummy, and this is their result. They described his remains as follows. Ramses II has a very large nasal bone. It is, between the eyes, very high and very pronounced. I agree with most of what they said, simply because it can be observed on his mummy and his depictions, but I have to disagree with the hue used for his skin, which in my opinion is too fair. And I will explain why. Why are we discussing Ramses II's skin color? The controversy about skin color in ancient Egypt is one of the most heated debates in ancient history. It is a contentious issue because of the civilization's significance in world history, and the fact that it shares borders with Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean adds to the complexity. We can all agree that the ancient Egyptians were most likely an ethnically diverse people. However, ethnic diversity does not necessarily imply extreme phenotypic variations, especially knowing the region from which all these ethnic groups came from. As numerous scholars have stated, during the formation of the Egyptian state that there was some form of homogeneity within that country. For example, they noticed that the indigenous inhabitants of Kemet had a feature called prognathism. A feature that is more prevalent among people with African ancestry and almost inexistent in non-black populations. So, if these people were indigenous to the African continent, they most likely had a lot of melanin in their skin. Today, there are many images of ancient Egyptians accessible. And, based on what we know, Kemites did their best to portray individuals as realistically as possible. And it is normal to think that a people will represent their deities and kings in their image. As in the instance of the Sphinx, which clearly has African traits, with that very strong prognathic jaw. Meaning that they carved it based on their own image, which is the image of black Africans. In terms of skin color, the ancient Egyptians mostly employed brown or black to represent their people. They utilized yellow to depict women, as seen in the following pictures. Scholars, however, explained that the yellow hue was symbolic, meaning that it was not necessarily representative of what women's skin color looked like. Knowing where they are from, it is evident that they must have had a lot of melanin, which is what shows on their realistic portrayals, especially during the Amarna period in the 18th dynasty. In terms of facial features, anything was possible owing to the wide range of phenotypes seen from West to East Africa. Large noses to aquiline noses, for example. However, the phenotypic and genetic diversity fluctuated throughout time based on historical events. Eric Crubazy, a French archaeologist from the University of Toulouse, said that there were various eras throughout Egypt's history when new genes were added to the indigenous pool, thus injecting new diversity and bringing new features that didn't exist previously. The most important modifications happened during the Greco-Roman era. The others happened between the pre- and post-Hyksos invasion eras. Check out my videos about those events. In other words, things started to change dramatically and natives started to complain about it. But despite these mutations, the image of what indigenous Egyptians looked like remained mostly unchanged. They continued to portray themselves as a dark-skinned nation. Even civilizations that met them at relatively late times described them as such. The ancient Egyptians categorized themselves based on where they resided, which was in Africa. In my previous videos, I discussed how they perceived themselves in relation to their neighbors. Click on the upper right corner of the screen to view the video. Other scholarly study reveals that there were many distinct skin colors in Egypt during Ramses II's reign, including what we now term white, brown, and black. And this is not anything I dispute. However, it is vital to note that ancient Egypt was conquered by different nations, who occupied that territory for centuries, and it was also a place of exile for all people seeking a better life. Something we can clearly see in the Bible, where several people seek exile in Egypt whenever problems arise in their countries, despite the fact that Pharaoh is described as a terrible person. Jesus himself escaped to Egypt. Following that logic, it makes perfect sense that at some point, there existed a large number of people who were not what we can term of Egyptian stock, but who were Egyptianized and acquired the Egyptian citizenship. They usually lived in the Delta region around the country's borders with Asia and Europe. So, logically, we can't use these people as symbol of what a typical Egyptian looked like. Keep this information in mind because it will be critical to understand the remainder of this video. In the instance of Ramses II, some researchers stated that microscopic inspection of the king's hair roots indicated that his hair was originally red, hinting that he came from a redhead family. As a result, the story of Ramses II being white or pale-skinned is based on his hair color. Because he had wavy hair that was perhaps red, these researchers assumed he had a pale complexion. The issue with that theory, debunking the myth. Professor Chai-Kanta Diop disputed those results and argued that that specific structure of hair morphology could not be used to exclude a potential African origin and that a comparative study should have featured Nubians in Upper Egypt before a conclusive judgment was reached. In the 1970s, Chai-Kanta Diop even asked the Egyptian government for permission to investigate these royal mummies and quantify the level of melanin in their skin. The offer was turned down. We should ponder why, if the people had genuine intentions, because this is the most precise approach to respond to that question. In 1980, James Harris and Edward Wendt performed a series of X-ray tests on the crania and skeletal remains of New Kingdom pharaohs, including Ramses II's mummified bones. The study discovered remarkable parallels between the New Kingdom monarchs of the 19th and 20th dynasties and Mesolithic Nubian samples in general. The investigators also discovered similarities between Levantine populations and present Mediterranean populations. Harris and Wendt proposed that this represented admixture, as contrary to the great majority of Egyptian pharaohs, the Ramessides were of northern origin, meaning that they came from the Delta region, which had been subject to numerous Asiatic invasions and occupations. On the other hand, Upper Egypt had almost never been occupied by foreigners until the complete fall of ancient Egypt. The distinction between Upper and Lower Egyptians can be seen in Egyptian art. For example, this is how both regions were depicted under the reign of Amenhotep III during the 18th dynasty, the dynasty preceding the one of Ramses II. Upper Egyptians were shown as being identical to other Nubian or black populations, whilst Lower Egyptians were depicted as having somewhat a slightly lighter skin pigmentation. It is reddish-brown and significantly darker than other fair-skinned populations. Remember that all pharaohs came from that region of Upper Egypt, whose population is depicted as similar to Nubian groups. The Ramesside dynasty was the first to come from the Delta. In other words, it was an exceptional event in the history of ancient Egypt. As a result, even the typical Lower Egyptian had dark complexion. It was never black in the south and white in the north in ancient Egypt. Although both regions were diversified, the typical indigenous inhabitant of both regions remained highly melanated. In other words, both were black, but in the north there was a higher diversity due to admixture, which probably led to new phenotypes and cultural practices that may share similarities with some from the Levant and Asia. According to the prophecy of the potter, that area was cosmopolitan. Memphis, the largest city of the area, was described during the Greek period as the all-nurturing city in which all the races of mankind live. So, Ramses's family originated in that area prone to foreign influences. Gaston Maspero, who first unwrapped the mummy of Ramses II, wrote, "On the temples there are few sparse hairs, but at the pole the hair is quite thick, forming smooth, straight locks about 5 centimeters in length. White at the time of death, and possibly auburn during life, they have been dyed a light red by the spices, henna, used in embalming. The mustache and beard are thin, the hairs are white, like those of the head and eyebrows, the skin is of earthy brown, splotched with black. The face of the mummy gives a fair idea of the face of the living king." He described the mummy's complexion as earthy brown with black splotches. However, we may not take this seriously because mummies undergo a mummification procedure that alters their appearance, making the final appearance less likely to be indicative of the live king's skin hue. Let's take it like this and go a little deeper. Let's discuss the king's official depictions. Ramses II is depicted in a variety of ways. Here are his most popular depictions. And, as you can see, 99.9% of them depict a person with dark complexion or a melanated human being, even though in terms of facial features, the styles varies. I am only aware of one statue depicting the monarch on a white stone that may make think that he had a fair complexion, but it, like many other white monuments in Egypt, most likely has lost its original brown or black pigments with time. As may be seen here. Many people cite these whitewashed statues to suggest that the Kemites were white people. However, as you can see, these statues are not in their original state, the color faded. The following painting is a wonderful piece of art representing Ramses II at war against a group of Nubian rebels. It portrays the pharaoh on his chariot defeating his southern opponents. And, as you can see, the artists did their best to match reality. Especially skin tones, facial features, and even nature, with these beautiful horses. In other words, there is nothing symbolic or fantasist about this artwork. Everything is painted according to reality. We cannot say that the colors were chosen based on color conventions in this case because they express a specific diversity in people and nature. This idea is backed up by the fact that Nubians are shown in 2 different hues. Some Nubians have black skin, while others have a brown complexion. A diversity that can still be observed in Black Africa today. There are exceptionally dark Africans, particularly in Sudan, South Sudan, Senegal, Mali, Ethiopia, Somalia, North Africa, etc., as well as brown-skinned Africans, who make up the majority of black Africans today. And they are visible in this artwork. What's more interesting is that they're facing the pharaoh and his people, who are painted using the same brown pigment used for the second group of Nubians. In other words, the Egyptians are explaining that they shared the same complexion as other Africans in the south. The horse's color is also validating this fact. Here are original depictions of Egyptians from the tomb of Seti I, father or Ramses II. And here are depictions of Egyptians from the tomb of Ramses III, ruler of the following 20th dynasty. If we compare both types to modern Africans, we can clearly see that their pigmentation is similar to the one of black Africans in general. Black and brown people. The ancient Egyptians were clearly dark and brown like all other indigenous Africans. Nowadays, the term brown people refers to all skin tones that are not white. But many of these brown people have nothing to do with the color brown. In other words, everything pale yet slightly tanned is classified as brown, which does not make sense. Today, North Africa and in the Middle East are regarded as brown people's areas. And, as a result, most people often claim that the complexion of the inhabitants of these areas remained the same since antiquity. But that's a lie. This is the ancient people's brown hue. And this is how the majority of individuals living in these areas look now. If we are being completely honest, we must recognize that it is not the same thing. We are manipulated to believe that it's identical, but it is not. This is pale skin that is a little yellow, white, or pink. And this is a highly melanated individual, similar to the skin tone of most black Africans. This is the ancient Egyptians' real brown hue. Here you can see an African-American woman next to a beautiful statue of Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Notice how they share the exact same skin tone. That's the true brown of Egypt. So, if this statue replicates Queen Hatshepsut's real complexion, it means that today she would be categorized as a black woman. By the way, here is her mummy, and as you can see, she seems to have strong tropical features with a very large nose. As you can see, despite having wavy hair, and contrary to what we are taught, ancient Egyptians have never depicted Ramses II with a pale complexion. The issue with hair is that we now identify particular phenotypes with non-melanated individuals. We don't realize that our world has changed a lot. It can't be used to represent what once was a few millennia ago. During these ancient time periods, the combination of human features varied a lot more than today. Features today associated to specific groups of people were not specific to them and were also found among the brown majority of the human population. Our planet has lost in diversity due to numerous genocides, to discriminations, racism, invasions, migrations, slavery, propaganda, and more. Many people in North Africa, Nubia, East Africa, and even West Africa exhibit a mix of traits that are considered unusual on the African continent, but may have been more frequent at times. Wavy hair, dark complexion, and tropical facial features, for example, were common, as shown in this photograph of a Nubian man from Aswan, in Egypt. The man has wavy hair, which is now regarded a white people characteristic, while the remainder of his facial features would be classified as Negroid or Africoid. That combination may not be particularly widespread all over Africa today, but it existed in ancient Egypt and can still be seen today in Egypt, Nubia, and other parts of Africa, for example. It does not mean that it has been given to them by some white Europeans who lived in the area. This next artwork depicts ancient Egyptian locals working in the field, and as you can see, the vast majority of them have typical African features, dark complexion, afro or kinky hair, and only 2 of them have a hair type that is distinct from the majority. They have wavy hair. That's the evidence that this type of hair existed in ancient Egypt, although it was still worn by people with dark skin. This leads us back to our video's theme. Pharaoh Ramses II most likely belonged to this group of Egyptians. He had a dark complexion and wavy hair. So, as you can see, having wavy hair has nothing to do with being fair-skinned. Especially not in the ancient world. His hair may have been red, or maybe it was henna, but still, it does not mean that he had fair skin. It is critical to remember that characteristics now associated with Europeans did not begin with Europeans or white people. Most people believe that they were passed down to black people through marrying or mingling. However, that's the other way around. This is why most people believe that Egyptians were divided into two groups, white in the north and black in the south. Now, I'm telling you that Egypt was not a mix of white and black people. It was a mix between black and black, but both groups carried unique mutations, and that's what is creating confusion today. However, this is the topic of a future video. I'll explain in details what happened, how it happened, and how scholars are manipulating our perception to whitewash the history of ancient Egypt. Make sure to like and subscribe if you don't want to miss that special video. Thanks for watching Mr. Imhotep's channel, and see you soon.